Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you all here today. Which I had the pleasure of touring with the director this afternoon, and you really do have a magnificent national museum in this establishment, now rehabilitated after 5 years. So it's an honor to be here to tell you a little bit about the background and issues related to the Harris Matrix and archaeological stratigraphy. I will say that my first visit to Spain was to Barcelona 25 years ago. And this was because some students wrote to me and said, "Dear Professor Harris, are you dead?" I wrote back and said the body was still alive, but not much hope for the brain. Anyway, I'm going to show you a series of pictures today and give you a bit of background as to why I'm here today, as it were, and to give you a sense of the journey that took place after the matrix was created. And of course, it's now in half a dozen languages, including Spanish, which appeared in 1991. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was born on the island of Bermuda, which sits on top of a 5,000-meter volcano with a limestone cap, and is a very big place at 37 square kilometers. It's all out on its own in the western North Atlantic, and to a large degree, we are of an island mentality, and so we see ourselves in a way apart from the rest of the world, almost like a satellite orbiting the Earth. So it may be possible in the circumstances that I did what I did with the matrix because I wasn't a part of a larger community or whatever, and so one could do something different and get away with it. I don't know what happened between the young boy there and there, but I'm sure that Darwin would say it was very unnatural selection that I should come from Bermuda to do that. Nevertheless, I started going to England to excavate in 1967 and found that I very much enjoyed the process of excavation, possibly because we learned how to build buildings as very young children. In a small place like Bermuda, you learn to do everything yourself. And archaeology, of course, is the reverse of building up buildings. Now, in those days, the archaeological tradition, as you can see exemplified by the director of the excavation in his army uniform, harked back to, in England, to General Pitt Rivers. And a number of the approaches that they used to excavating and recording were sort of military, and this is how they like to be seen. However, when we were digging, there were other social orders which you couldn't get away with today. On such sites like this as a director today, it wouldn't happen. This is not correct. This is where we learned how to do it all. These were wonderful sites that we worked on, full of beautiful stratification. And in the Sun in Winchester, over a period of 6 years, I learned how to excavate and to take apart an archaeological site in the reverse order to which it had been built up. I was a bit of a hippie too, but like Bill Clinton, I never inhaled. One of the sites that we worked on was the Anglo-Saxon cathedral that was destroyed by the Normans when they built the present-day Winchester Cathedral. So the original tower for the cathedral was here, before 1066, as it were, and the Normans dug out all of the foundations. They dug all around the cathedral and, of course, disturbed all of the graves. They kept them all and then reburied them. So here you had about a meter by about 10 meters of skulls and all the body parts to the other side. Now I show you this site because at this time people began to get interested in what we eventually would call negative features or interfaces. These stratigraphic units that destroy pre-existing stratification. The other thing that was happening at this time was one was beginning to get a sense that the surface of stratification was more important than the vertical view. So this is a site I worked on for 2 summers, the Bishop's Palace at Winchester, and the series of pictures you'll now see show you the surface aspect of stratification rather than presenting a cross-section through the site. So this goes from late to early, and earlier still, and then into the Anglo-Saxon period, and finally, underneath everything else, a Roman building with a tessellated floor. Now, in those days, the way of recording surfaces was to make these very elaborate plans with drawing frames and so on. They were very time-consuming. The excavation stopped for a week or 2 while you made these plans. But this was considered the thing to do at the time. But the problem with it is that you're making an assumption that you can define a period surface before you've analyzed the artifacts. And you're also locking up the data, because when you do a plan like this, then when you remove something, if you remove this on the plan, normally there was no plans done of the surface underneath of it. So you're locking up the data and you're not recording everything that should be recorded. In 1972, I went to Norway to excavate for a year, and it was a bit of a culture shock because they did digging and recording in a different way. And they made an assumption, according to historic records, that there had been, say, 5 fires which destroyed the town. And so everything stratigraphically was related to these fires. The only problem was, when I arrived, they'd left a pile of stratification below where they were presently digging, and they said I had to start at the top and dig down. Well, the only problem, when I got to the bottom, I had 8 fires. So stratigraphically, you began to think, what's the correlation between these? You've got too many. So it started a process of thinking about which or what was the correct way of recording stratification, because we had the English way and then we had the Norwegian at Bergen way. Anyway, it was during this time that new archaeology came into being, and David Clark from Cambridge came and gave a lecture at Norway about new archaeology and models and all these things, all very exciting. So I decided I'd go to Cambridge. Reject. No Cambridge. So I went back to Winchester, where I didn't do any digging, but I was given a site that had already been excavated, and I was told to sort it out. And what we now mean by sort it out is to build a stratigraphic sequence of the site. So I was faced with 70 site notebooks full of stratigraphic information, several hundred plans, lots of sections, and we tried to sort this out to find out what the sequence was for this very complex site. So we often had things like this that looked like a bad road accident, trying to figure out what the sequence was. So I started to tidy these up because I felt if I couldn't see where I was going down through the site, I would never arrive at a solution for its stratigraphic sequence. Anyway, it was one evening, the end of February 1973, where I was doing one of these tidy up plans, and underneath of it I had a piece of gridded metric paper. And I started drawing little half-centimeter rectangles. And towards the end of the evening, I had a sheet of paper that looked like this. And from this, I had a sense that the world had changed, had shifted. And so it proved to be. Now, one thing I want to mention, this is a copy of the original, and on the thing here it says layer chart, because it was some time before we appreciated that the diagrams that you would make with this Harris matrix were stratigraphic sequences. They weren't just layers, but they were surfaces and layers. But anyway, it took about 5 years after that came into being to work out all of the issues as to the way we recorded archaeological sites, so that when you tried to make a stratigraphic sequence, it didn't come out right. It was the original computer thing of garbage in and garbage out. And we were fortunate in a sense because the original theory of the matrix was true to begin with. And there are basically two types of relationships that you're representing in the diagram. One is the unit is in superposition, and the other, it's not in superposition. And from that, you can build up the most complex stratigraphic sequence containing thousands and thousands of layers. Before this, and I will say this early now, archaeological sites are a time capsule, and time is not visible unless you put it into a diagram. And your lives are ruled by 2 diagrams, and if you're a good archaeologist, 3 diagrams. The first one is the clock face, shows you what time of day it is, not when the sun comes up, but what time of day it is. And of course the Gregorian calendar, which allows you to organize your life. On an archaeological site, you now have the diagrams presented in a Harris matrix, which are a calendar of the site. They represent, if you will, the unique DNA model of the site. And that is their ultimate value. Now, in the old days, if you asked me what I was as an archaeologist, what was my paradigm, I would point to one of these. That's what I'm all about, the cross-section through the site. And we tended to look at these in isolation, but on this little site at the top, these are actually all one section. But the only way you can see them is to convert that physical information into a diagram of time. So each of these has its own sequence, and when you combine them, you end up with a stratigraphic sequence, which is a diagram of the buildup of all these layers and surfaces in this little diagram. And then we later suggested you could throw in the other information from plans and so on. But the real key to the matter, before I go on to that, this was the first stratigraphic sequence ever made, and this was for the Lower Brook Street site. As I said, the 70 notebooks. To put this together, it's about 10,000 stratigraphic units, but the site was under-recorded by at least 40% because they didn't record a lot of the surfaces, and it took about 3 months to put that together after the fact of excavation. And these sequences immediately tell you almost what type of site you have and what's going on with the site. So here you have the Roman period, and you have a contraction in the Saxon period, and then in the medieval, post-medieval period, a number of houses are built on the site, and your sequence explodes, because of course you have development inside the house and development outside the house. One of the issues with the records, because they didn't have this controlling method, was that you often forgot to put in complete stratigraphic relationships. So this is the Anglo-Saxon period, which we dug away completely because we went to Roman. But in many instances, there's nothing underneath in the records or nothing on the top because you weren't doing this at the time. It was being left till after the fact. And this was part of the problem. And also, it was a reflection at the time on these urban sites that people were digging more stratigraphically, therefore they were finding a lot more material, a lot more units of stratification, and they began to face a complexity of numbers that hadn't been seen before in archaeology. And that's the stratigraphic sequence for the first site that was actually dug, and then we made a stratigraphic sequence almost immediately thereafter. And of course, these sequences, representing all the units and surfaces that you've numbered, can be grouped into phases. The phases then can be grouped into periods, all based upon stratigraphic relationships. So these become the testing pattern for all later analysis of your site. And the reason for that, of course, is that artifacts are totally unreliable because they can travel, as you know. And if you're digging, you're done, there's always problems with the artifacts. Are they in the right chronological order and so on? But this forms a testing pattern, and provided you record it correctly, you have an unbiased record of the buildup of the site. The reason for that is that no one goes out to make stratification. So when this building was remodeled, or when its foundations were laid, none of the workmen were building stratification. They were building a building. And a byproduct of that, for us archaeologists, is stratification. So it's an unbiased record of the past, provided you can record it correctly. So part of the issue before was the concentration on looking at the vertical view of a site. The problem with that is that we have to dig from the top. We can't dig sideways. And every time you move a fraction of a millimeter, you get a different section. So you simply can't have enough sections to give you a complete stratigraphic sequence. But if you approach it from the top, which we did in an experiment, I think this was probably 1973, they were digging an Iron Age ditch in Winchester. So we asked the archaeologist to record every surface on the site. Just a very simple outline with a few spot heights on it, but all based upon the grid of the site. And he found that this was very easy to do, and the result was that you can overlay all of these plans and see the stratigraphic buildup of the site. You can also, of course, nowadays, and you of the younger generation live in a wonderful time where you have all these computers and wonderful programs, but if you have this surface information on your computer, you can make a section drawing wherever you want. So you're not losing anything in the bargain. So the change in the paradigm, if you will, in archaeology is from the single paradigm of depth to 4 dimensions. Because each of these represents the 3 dimensions of a deposit and surface, or 2 dimensions of a surface, plus its relationship in time. So there's three physical dimensions plus the time relationship. So this is a 4-dimensional diagram, which is why it's a calendar, and this is where we need to be in terms of excavating and recording and understanding the development of archaeological sites. So, now I was not alone in this process. People were moving towards an understanding. We're moving towards an understanding that doing large sites in small cubes wasn't the best way of seeing surfaces, and also it meant that you ended up having small cubes of information with nothing in the middle of it. If you recorded all of the surfaces, you had total coverage of the site. And that's the difference between surfaces and deposits. Surfaces you can record in their entirety, deposits you can only sample. So we began, if you will, to free up the archaeological sites from having large, very large bulks, which were obviously very convenient for wheelbarrows, to temporary bulks, and then in some instances to no bulks at all. And then many of you have seen this diagram from Philip Barker's textbook, where the English, and I'm sure other people, started to do what they called open area excavation, which we would now say is open surface excavation. In other words, you're concentrating on the surfaces and recording the surfaces before you dig the deposits. And this all ties in to the principles of stratification, in that stratification is a 2-part entity. It's use and disuse. And on every archaeological site you have 2 periods. You have a period where you're building something, but once it's finished building, it's into disuse. So this is a disuse period, and the surface is the period that you're using it. So there are 2 types of surfaces. And if you look at a lot of earlier archaeological reports, these 2 are joined together. They're conflated when they shouldn't be. Now, if I ask any of you as an archaeologist, what is one of the major things you should do when you finish digging? What can you do with your information when you finish digging? And hopefully some would say, I want to reconstruct the site. And the reconstruction of an archaeological site is the reconstruction of the surfaces, not of the deposits. And that has to stand up to simple logic. I'm standing on a surface. It probably took a year to build, and it's been in use now for 10 years. So most surfaces on archaeological sites survive much longer than deposits. And people live on the surfaces, they don't live in the deposits. The deposits are very important because they're the repository of artifacts and ecofacts that allow you to move the stratigraphic sequence based upon an outside chronological scale. So again, this is the basic principle. 2 aspects, the twins of stratification: digging, making strata, erosion, accumulation, yin and yang of stratification. And of those, the most important to record are the surfaces. There will always be surfaces, and quite often, of course, on most sites there will be more surfaces than there are deposits. Even from the simple example, at some point you stop digging and you have to record the last surface and you don't dig anymore. So there are always more surfaces than deposits on archaeological sites. And on complex sites, such as urban sites, you get a lot of surfaces that have no deposits. So if I cut an electricity trench through the floor here, I'm destroying pre-existing stratification, creating a new surface that has no deposits. So surfaces were the key to understanding how to create a stratigraphic sequence on an archaeological site. And a professor asked me yesterday about the controversy between an archaeologist called Bersu and Mortimer Wheeler. And some of you may have read about this. It was a controversy about when you do a section drawing, do you put in hard lines between deposits or not? And this controversy raged for some time, and Mortimer Wheeler and others said you must put in these hard lines. But what they didn't do, they were moving towards it, what they didn't do is saying is that those hard lines represent the surfaces, and the surfaces are the key to understanding stratification. Anyway, life went on from there, if I can say it that. This is a very simple rundown of it, but it was that business of the surfaces that I was introduced to by a colleague of mine called Lawrence Keane, and once he talked about how they were doing it on one of his digs, you began to understand immediately. If you recorded all the surfaces and you noted the relationship between them and the deposits and other surfaces, you could reconstruct the site and therefore reconstruct a stratigraphic sequence at any time. So the surfaces became the key to the whole business. Anyway, so we went on from there. We did various experiments. I went to London, and they were digging a very large site next to St. Paul's Cathedral, and I asked them to test the system, which they did with the consent of their director, Brian Hobley, at the time. And they came back at the end of it and said, this makes our job easier. We understand what we're doing. It's a control on the excavation. When you have, as you're building the stratigraphic sequence, as you dig, a new person comes onto the site, say, here's where you are. You're starting to dig underneath of it, and you continue down from there. This gentleman, this was a couple years ago, he's working on an enormous stratigraphic sequence, doing it by hand, but of course now you have a number of wonderful programs that you can do it with. Anyway, this took hold, and seen in other representations, this was the stratigraphic cake that the people in Vienna made for the 35th anniversary of the matrix, and in this case we ate all the evidence. It's being used on all sorts of stratigraphic situations, not only underwater sites, but rock art, paintings, standing buildings, all sorts of things. So now it's available in programs which you put in the information, put a line between the two units in the direction that says one is on top of the other, and so on. Hit the button and it draws your stratigraphic sequence. This is made by my colleagues in Vienna. I have no monetary interest in it, but it's the Harris Matrix Composer, which makes music for your site. And then Apple Computer, when they were advertising one of their iPads several years ago, showed some archaeologists at Pompeii who used the iPad to keep track of their sequences. Now, the matrix is now 41 years old, but it shows no sign of slowing down. And recently in the United States, a group of arson investigators are beginning to push for the idea that arson sites should be investigated by archaeologists, not by the SWAT team or the police or whatever. But these are archaeological entities and their investigation should take place upon stratigraphic methods. And then this book with a strange title has a whole chapter on archaeological ethics, but there's nothing in it to talk about the ethics of excavation and to what standards we should hold archaeologists who go out and excavate. And this is an issue that we have to address because some people continue to excavate in a non-stratigraphic manner, and they don't come away with a stratigraphic sequence for their sites. There's another issue which is going to come up, and I'm just showing this slide because I was in the Basque Country a little while ago where there's a bit of a controversy. I've had a look at some of the work, very fine excavations, and they use the matrix, so of course it must be true. But the point here is that we're now eventually going to face the question of admissible evidence in court. And this is particularly true with regard to genocide sites, where there are still the two methods of excavation taking place, and eventually this is going to end up in court as it will in other circumstances. So the question is, if you go to court and the judge and the jury are going to decide on the evidence you've presented as an archaeologist, who is going to come out on top? The people who use stratigraphic methods, produce a stratigraphic sequence, record their surfaces, or people who do it in another way. And these are issues that we are going to have to face moving forward. But anyway, the matrix continues to take root, which is wonderful, and I think the evidence of a lot of younger people here today suggests that it may still have some validity. It's ended up in a number of textbooks, and it's also here. This was the party that we had in Vienna for the 35th anniversary. It was a whole Roman town which we ate, including the burials and so on. So it's taken hold of people's imaginations. There was an American archaeologist who has the lovely name of Kathleen Wheeler. And those of you who know a bit about English archaeology know there are sort of two greats in the 50s and 60s, Dame Kathleen Kenyon and Sir Mortimer Wheeler. So she couldn't go wrong, and then she also named her cat Harris. And then one day from India, Ravi, archaeologist, sent me a letter. I've been reading to write for you a long time. We've named our son Harris. And I wrote back and I said, well, this is wonderful and a nickname, but forget it, No, here's the birth certificate. So this poor chap has to run around with an Anglo name in the deepest parts of India. It's also entered into various bits of modern literature. This Jesus video, whatever, and Harris there and so forth. And those of you who like to read detective novels, like this one here, it's also there. It's talking about an aerial shot of the site on one wall, a Harris matrix facing it, the strata of the excavation reformed as diagrams. I don't know whether it had to do with the murder or not, but anyway. So, stratification is, to me, the most wonderful part about archaeology, particularly if you're excavating. And if you can learn to think stratigraphically, it changes the whole way you look at the world. And of course, the whole world is nothing but a great stratigraphic concept. And so at one point I made this matrix of the world, where we started off in the center, and then you had the geology swirling around with all its layers and what have you, rocks and what have you. And then out of it, of course, you would have archaeological sites. springing forth and eventually being connected. Now, the point of all that is that we took our concepts of archaeology, archaeological stratigraphy, from geology, and we didn't change them. And part of the thrust behind the matrix was to say that we need our own stratigraphy. We need our archaeological stratigraphy because we create phenomena that don't exist in nature. And therefore, we need our own rules and regulations in order to understand the material to which we've been entrusted as archaeologists. So we had to break away from the geologists. And any of you who follow things in America know for a while there was quite a storm between the geoarchaeologists who were geologically based and archaeologists who said we had to have a revolution and move things ahead. They've now been largely started, but anyway, it's now in a number of languages. And as I'm sure the younger people know, most of these editions now are available for free on the website, which we created. We bought out the publishers because it was too expensive, and we put it for free on the internet where it will remain. So as you can see there, it's in Spanish, strange language, all these other languages, Japanese and Hungarian, and it's now coming out in German and Czech. It'll be in Chinese later this year, and two people are working on a French and Russian edition. Part of the reason for putting it on the website as well is, as you know, the way to get to the entire world now is through the internet. And so that's one of the reasons why we decided, and my colleagues from the University of Vienna have set the website up and they've been maintaining it. And so here you can see a couple of maps, you know, these hit maps that you can make up of who's visited your site. And so that was in 2008, and you can see here the world is becoming very red. And slowly but surely, you know, we're taking over. And the diagram is at the bottom is when I was in Spain 25 years ago, and we went to Girona for a conference. And this was a little leaflet that they'd made up, and it had the schedule on the other side, and you could fold it out. And when we got to Girona, we found every tree and telephone pole had one of these wrapped around it and stapled to let the general folks know that Matrix was in town or something. So we return back to the business of surfaces and holes. The surfaces that are holes, such as when you dig a well or you dig a trench, are the problem children in stratification because they disrupt the normal superimposed layering, and they have to be dealt with properly, or the material inside of them can't take their proper place in the stratigraphic sequence. And because of a failure, or it just didn't come at the time, to understand the value of surfaces in stratigraphic analysis, many sites simply, many archaeologists in a way, simply dug a hole into history to a large degree by not fully recording the surfaces of archaeological sites and the information that they represented. So we like to think now that we're moving to a state where when we do an archaeological excavation, we're capturing all of the surfaces on that site, and therefore we can end up with a proper stratigraphic sequence. Well, you can see I'm an example of what happened here. The diseases of the brain. Anyway, this is a recent friend of mine who does these arty photographs, but he did this without my real consent, but he put the matrix on the floor, and that was a bottle of wine that they produced in Vienna as well, which they made me lug home and so forth. But anyway, so just to go back, if I may. It So this was an interesting journey for me. I'm very pleased that I was able to sort of do it. Ended up doing my PhD thesis on it by accident, and so I was able to spend some time really looking into methods in archaeological stratigraphy and to come up with some suggestions for how things might be done differently, better, more efficiently, and then allow you as digging archaeologists to spend your time on the more important work, which is the analysis of everything after the fact. And again, I come back to the fact that these are the DNA model, if you will, of an archaeological site. These are the testing patterns against which all categories of artifacts must be compared and analyzed. And you cannot, no artifact can change this sequence. Even if you got the sequence wrong, you have to make some things about it, but they cannot change the sequence. They can only make it grow or collapse depending on the chronological information with an outside time scale that they represent. So these stratigraphic sequences, which is what they are, forget the Harris matrix, these are stratigraphic sequences showing you a time chart for each archaeological site, which is unique to each archaeological site, which is its value. But of course, the other point about it is that you can use this on any archaeological site in the world because it's based upon the principles of stratification, not on whether this is Roman or medieval or whatever it is. If you want to be a good excavator, you can produce wonderful excavation data and stratigraphic sequences without knowing anything about the artifacts. Now, I'm speaking in an extreme, but that's the point of it. This is stratigraphic matters, and your job as a digging archaeologist is to leave the site with this thing under your arm, which should not be a problem because, of course, digging each day, you can only dig so many deposits each day by hand, and you build your sequence up as you go on the site hut wall. So, as I said before, from my point of view, stratification is one of the most interesting aspects of being an archaeologist, and the more we understand what it's all about and the more we record it, the greater truths we'll find and the greater justice we will do to the archaeological sites we will dig. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's about it for me at the moment. I don't give long, consider academic speeches. I'm just touching the surfaces. But the surfaces are always there. They're the key to stratification. And I hope you've all enjoyed that. And we can certainly do a number of questions because they're always fun to get some interaction and to see what you all. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk this evening. And thanks to all of you for coming out. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you, particularly the younger people who are the archaeologists of the future. Remember, according to the students in Barcelona, I'm dead.